Hi, in this video we're going to have a look at a harmonium piece written by Rossini. Well, this comes from Rossini's Petite Messe Solennelle, which is a piece he wrote in 1863, and he'd long since retired from writing operas, and then he decides to set the words of the Mass, obviously a religious piece, but he does it in a very operatic way. Actually, it's a wonderful work. So if you don't know it, have a listen to it, and you'll hear all these wonderful things that sound like operatic arias while he's actually working through the words of the Mass. And over the years, I've been asked to play the harmonium part in this piece. There's not that much music written for the harmonium, lots of little short voluntaries and so on. But in this case, the harmonium features largely in the score. So you've got a score for a choir, SATB choir, you've got soloists, and you've got a piano part and a harmonium part. So I've often been asked to play the harmonium part. So what's a harmonium? Well, a harmonium is another keyboard instrument. It's really a kind of reed organ. And many churches in the past had a harmonium because probably it was cheaper to put a harmonium in than it was to pay for a pipe organ. So it's a kind of poor person's organ at one level, but it is a reed organ. So the sound is produced by air coming into the instrument and blowing the air through these reeds, so you get this very reedy sound. And just like an organ, it's got different stops, so there are different kind of combinations of these reed stops that you can produce. You have to kind of pump it with your feet, so you're pumping air through the whole thing all the time, unless of course it's been blessed with an electric blower that's been put in at a later date. And you also have to do interesting things with your knees, because you have these kind of crescendo diminuendo things where you put your knees together and it's quiet, and as you pull your knees apart you're pushing these levers out and it gets louder. So you can change the stops, you can do this stuff with your knees, you keep pumping, so it's good for keeping fit. So it's an interesting instrument to play. But I thought we'd just have a look at a movement in Rossini's Mass that is written for the harmonium. Now it says in the score that it can be played on the harmonium or the piano, but this is the big harmonium solo that comes in this piece. And it's a rather beautiful piece. I'm sorry we can't generate a harmonium sound, so you're just going to hear it with piano sound. So you'll have to use your imagination about that. But it's a rather charming little piece. And it starts off with this monophonic idea. So you think it's going to be a fugue, because it sounds like a fugue subject. And then we get something that sounds like the fugue answer. So in other words, the subject comes in the tonic key in one voice that's unaccompanied, and then a second voice enters with the same idea, but in the dominant key. That's exactly what happens here. So you think, oh wow, this is going to be a fugue. Actually, it turns out not to be a fugue. So it's more a bit of fugato, which is kind of sort of pretending to be a fugue, and then it wanders off and does other things. So it's quite interesting from a composer point of view. If you want to sound something that sounds a bit fugal, but doesn't actually turn out to be a fugue, well, this is a little lesson in how you might go about doing that in any musical style. But it's also quite an interesting little exploration of how you can start off with something that's contrapuntal that then becomes a little bit more homophonic as it goes. And what is presented as the fugue subject is quite a long statement. You know, it starts here and it takes us all the way down there. By the way, these little numbers, like number 1, are telling the player which of these stops to pull out, which sets of reeds to use. So just in case you're wondering what that's about. So here's this little bit of a fugue subject in F sharp minor. And I think it's interesting as well, because you hear that it's broken into these short fragments and then turns into a kind of longer idea. So like many fugue subjects, it has a head and a tail. We hear the head at the beginning. Then the head is used again, just sort of transposed. and then it's used again. And then it's used again, but this time extended into this great long tail. So here's the tail. So it's a very long kind of fugue subject, isn't it? But you see how the construction is designed with a head and a tail. That's often typical of a fugue subject. You also notice right from the beginning of this, there's lots of sequence, isn't there? So this 4-note cell, just taken up a third. And then taken up another third. Then taken up another third before it goes into the tail. And you can hear the impact of this 4-note rising sequence. It kind of builds intensity because it's climbing, doesn't it? And then the tail gradually takes us down. So we have this idea, and then it's kind of the same idea but slightly modified, and this idea of these falling fourths with adjacent notes in between, and then a little bit more disjunct towards the end. So you can see how Rossini has designed this to work really well as a kind of fugue subject. Then the next thing is that we have this second entry, because all of this today has just been monophonic. So this is the second entry, what we call the answer in fugal terms, because if this was in F sharp minor, this is in C sharp minor, and you notice all this stuff is a perfect fifth higher than the original. So this is the original subject. When the answer comes at the end of the page, you can hear that this is now in the dominant key. And then you hear the same thing happening again. And then it's wandering into this long tail. And then at this point, well, really the whole thing kind of breaks down. It's interesting that he has hints of the fugue subject at the top of the texture. You can see that sort of opening. But just the first 3 notes. And the rising thing again. So you get a sort of sense that, oh yeah, we're doing that fugue subject again, but it isn't really quite the fugue subject. And then it goes into these kind of descending sequential things, which again is kind of using the tail of the original subject. So this is how you present something that could be a fugue subject. You present the answer. We then haven't got a third entry that's repeating the original fugue subject, which is what we might expect, but we're then using the material from this fugue subject to write something that is partly contrapuntal, partly homophonic. So maybe now's a good time just to get a feel for, well, how does all this kind of connect? So have a listen to this. Turn the page. Now this is when you really know that the fugue has broken down. Because suddenly at this point, it breaks into 4 parts. A fugue's not going to do that. You have one line on its own, then the second entry comes in, then the third entry, usually with the fugue subject again, and then there may be a 4th entry or a 5th entry, depending on how many parts there are on the fugue, before we go on into the middle section of the fugue. But this is all now broken down, and he takes us to this cadence in F sharp minor. It's kind of a nice breathing spot. And notice these kind of lower, darker textures. And then he starts again. And as I say, there's a hint of the head of the fugue subject going on at the top there, but it isn't really a complete statement of it. And now we've got 3 parts going. The third part hasn't announced a new fugue subject. So it's still a little bit contrapuntal. It's still related to the original material, but now we know we're not listening to a fugue. So from that cadence, we go on like this. And you notice again, he's come to another one of those cadences, 4 parts, very similar to that cadence. But all the way through here, you probably heard all that sequential idea going on and all this kind of falling quaver 8th note material that belongs to the tail of that fugue subject. Well, what does he do? He carries on kind of using the quavers, the 8th notes of the tail, but this time we've got this ascending scale. And then we've got a second part that's imitating behind. So you feel this imitation. So it's still feeling a bit contrapuntal, isn't it? We're still getting a sense of, is it really a bit fugal? Well, it kind of is, but the fugue has really kind of sort of broken down a bit now, isn't it? So it's a very interesting exercise in how do you write something that sort of starts being fugal, carries on being a bit contrapuntal, but is also a bit homophonic, and how do we kind of blend those things into a texture that's a little bit of a hybrid texture. You notice Rossini loves his accidentals as well. You know, we've had all sorts of exciting double sharps and things, which just adds to the fun when you're playing it. And then you'll notice we've come to a kind of structural point. So number 4 is telling us about change in sound, and then there's a 0 to follow. That's helping to kind of paint the structure. So then we have a fairly short phrase that starts here like this. And another cadence. You see how he keeps writing these cadences. You may say it's a little bit of a weakness that the thing keeps stopping at these cadences and then starting again. But I think Rossini is quite clever in the way that he has these short statements and then he'll follow it with something longer. So one more short statement about to come, and you notice he's exploring keys. We've just finished in F sharp, sort of F sharp minor, but with a tierce to Picardy. And then that's a sort of trigger to go to B minor, because F sharp major is the dominant chord of B minor. But then he ends with a tierce to Picardy in B major. So it's all this stuff is really pretty sequential on the previous phrase. And you see how he's kind of using the tierce to Picardy each time as he did there. You think you're in F sharp minor, oh, last chord's F sharp major. B minor, last chord's B major. And then that's the trigger for the next thing. And then Rossini loves to write these long sequences. Have a listen to this next thing that's happening. And he carries on this sequence that you think is just going to end, it keeps going. Sorry. All the way to there. So it's a long sequence. And he's kind of building with his crescendo to a forte here, where he just kind of sort of changes gear a little bit. So something a bit more strongly homophonic is about to happen, where you have these kind of slightly displaced tenor notes on the weak beats, and then we build up to a fortissimo with this bit of drama taking us to the next cadence. So how does this go? Cadence we just reached, and then he kicks off again, noticing how he does this ascending scale with the bass part tracking behind it. So still something contrapuntal, but all kind of belonging to earlier materials. Very integrated, isn't it, into this whole structure. Onto the dominant chord of C sharp minor, and then off he goes again. Same figure. And then he comes to a cadence, but this time he sort of keeps going. Bit of drama here. I love this chromatic harmony. So this time more repetition than sequence, but really enjoying his chromatic movements. Isn't this lovely? This kind of harmony here. You see how this is going up chromatically and down, and the tenor part is going the other way. So you get this kind of whoa, and again, and then he kind of changes to this where we go into G sharp major, lovely key. So you see how that goes. And when it gets to G sharp major, he kind of calls a halt at this cadence and then says, do you know what? That G sharp major chord is chord 5 in C sharp minor. And then what do we get? We get this link, and then we get, oh, the fugue subject. You see how it's come back in the left hand. And then here comes the tail of it. And then it kind of wanders off. And you can see how the right hand is kind of using material from earlier on. And then all this is kind of a bit sequential. So there's a sort of return of the fugue subject idea, isn't there? Then this low 4-part texture again that he loves to take us to another homophonic cadence. And then what happens? Well, we get a bit more of this fugue subject thing, with earlier material in the left hand, so it feels a bit like subject and counter subject going on, even though it sort of isn't. Long sequences, here they are again, short sequence. And another 4-part cadence, and then off he goes again with the ascending scale. So you see how he's using these ideas over and over. And then the tierce de Picardy to B major, repeating this. We've heard this before, haven't we? So it's a revisit of this. And then E major, and then he has this kind of rather gentle passage. Beautiful sequence. It goes on and on. You think it's going to stop, but he just keeps going. Listen to the length of this sequence. Until we get there, and suddenly, whew, relief. And then he's going back to something we had before with these kind of displaced notes on the second beats. And then he goes into this drama that he had before. Then repeats it sort of around a diminished seventh, and then a dominant chord of F sharp, and then he goes round this again. You get the idea as to how this movement unfolds. So it's a very good example of how you do something that is fugal without being a fugue. So you can call it fugato. And he makes reference back to the fugue subject all the way through. And there's still quite a bit more of this to come, by the way. Then we have kind of counter subject ideas that come back. We have homophonic moments. We have a lot of very defined cadences where everything stops and starts again, something that tends not to happen in a fugue. And he just blends the homophonic with the polyphonic writing. So this movement is one of the least operatic moments in the whole piece, and you'll be quite surprised if you don't know the piece as to how operatic some of this stuff is. So if you're looking for something that sounds like an opera that's got a religious text, this is your piece, the Petit Messe Solennelle by Rossini. And here he is being his most religious, if you like, with this thing that's sort of based on this fugal idea, full of chromatic harmony that's also interesting, lots of chromatic melodic movement as well. And as you can see, he calls this thing the Preludio Religioso. So, little insight into Rossini, kind of off-piste, if you like, not doing the kind of stuff that he normally does. But there it is. And a rare moment to hear something that's really quite an extended harmonium solo. So I hope that's something a little bit different that's of interest. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, let me invite you to the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. And when you get to the homepage, you might like to click on Maestros. Maestros is our international community, and it's a great way of pulling people together who are interested in the kind of content that we provide. And you can join Maestros without worrying about your ability in any way whatsoever. Level 1 is the first engagement level. It's not an ability thing at all. And for very low cost, you can become a level 1 member. You have all sorts of perks that come with that and exciting emojis and so on. You also have early access to our videos. Now, how about that? That's definitely worth coming on. So if you just want to engage at level 1, we'd be very pleased to see you as a level 1 Music Matters Maestro. If you want to step on, well, levels 2 and 3 await you as well. So please come and join us as a level 1 member. It's a great way of just engaging with us a bit more deeply, and a great way of just offering us a little bit of support so we can keep everything going as we're doing it. And if you're wanting to join at a level 2 or level 3 member, then you'll see exactly how to do that when you click on Maestros and join us, hopefully as a level 1 member. It'd be great to have you with us if you're not already a member of Maestros. www.mmcourses.co.uk.